Hey everybody, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. And I was watching a thing a long time ago where some comedy writers were talking about how they make their bits hit harder. And one of the things they were saying is that using terminology that is oddly specific and that includes a funnier word than a more generic word, they couldn't tell you why. It just makes things funnier. So being like, oh, that thing is bigger than a car is not as funny as that thing is bigger than a Buick. And in the same way, I think that maybe flogging is something that so many jokes have been cracked about because it's such a funny sounding word that maybe it doesn't sound as bad as just good old fashioned whipping. Whip sounds mean and sharp, and it seems like the thing you would say. Flog sounds like the kind of thing that you want to put in a meme. And so it's really easy. It was very easy even for me when I was going through the book of Acts when we did this in visual form over on the YouTube channel years ago. It was really easy when we got to the flog stuff to just kind of put a bit of a funny tone on it, because just listen to the word flog. You have to use all of the same parts of your throat and your mouth and your face that you do when you say flam. It's just a funny sounding word, but it is not a funny thing to have happen to you. I don't know that because of ever having been flogged. I know that from doing homework over the years about what being flogged is like, how a flog is designed, and what it's meant to accomplish. Now, I don't know when we're going to get to it. Maybe we'll do it next time around. But I do want to talk about the Romans' elaborate hierarchy of torturous punishment and execution methods, because it's actually relevant to our conversation, because stuff means stuff, right? Like if I hold up my pointer finger and wave it at you, that means something. But if I hold up my middle finger and wave it at you, that means something different. They're both fingers, but stuff means stuff. It's important for understanding anything, and especially understanding something important. So we're going to get to that. But the flogging meant something, like we talked about yesterday. This is a punishment for an insurrectionist, for a murderer. And Jesus is taking that punishment for stuff he didn't do at all directly on behalf of somebody else, or in the stead of somebody else, in this case, Barabbas. But specifically, it says in Matthew 27:26, then he released Barabbas, that's Pilate, released Barabbas to them. That's released to the Jewish crowds. A lot of ambiguous pronouns here out of context. But he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. And I think for you and me, we read that, we're like, oh, okay, flogged, yeah, whatever. But the crucified thing, that's the real trouble. Okay, yeah, but first let's talk about the flogging, because that matters. Flogging was a form of punishment that up until really right about this time, maybe a decade after the crucifixion of Christ, flogging was something that anybody could be subjected to if they destabilized things anywhere in the Roman Empire. That seemed to be their favorite reason to apply the flog, their favorite way to send the message. If you destabilized something, however, and you were a politician, you couldn't be flogged, because as has always been the case for millennia and millennia, the rules apply to the people for whom the rules are made, and the people who make the rules get odd special exemptions. Strange how that is. Women also could not be flogged. So say what you will about Rome being backwards on a whole bunch of things involving gender roles and women's rights, you got to give them credit for at least being somewhat chivalrous in this regard and not flogging their ladies. Shortly after the time of Jesus, and we don't know exactly where, because it's not like there's a decree or an edict or something where it changed, but somehow it became either legally permissible or just fashionable to say, we're going to extend that no flogging deal to all Roman citizens. So flogging then would be reserved for outsiders, residents, barbarians, and slaves, but citizens would receive some other inhumane punishment, just not the shame and the scourge of flogging. But what is flogging, and how is it different from whipping? Well, a whip would usually be made out of braided leather that would move from a relatively thick hand-sized grip all the way down to a very fine tip. So it would be tapered, it would be diminishing. And what happens when you snap that whip, my buddy Destin made a fantastic video about the energy transfer that occurs. And literally, Jeff, please link that below so people can watch it, because it really explains a lot about how this pain is inflicted, and it applies to the flogging thing as well. But as that energy is loaded in the quick movement of the wrist, it's accelerated all the way down to the end of that whip, and that single snap that looks like almost nothing isn't nothing when you get popped with it. Even a clumsy whip like a rolled towel in a locker room can give you a pretty good pop. Imagine how much more so a weapon designed to do so would accomplish that. And this would leave lashes and injuries, would open up the flesh on somebody who was being whipped. Flogging, however, was next level. You didn't have the super long braids that would create that same energy transfer that you get, well, in fly fishing, something I like to do. You take the rod back, you take the rod forward, that long line. The more you let it stretch out behind you, the more it curls and extends that energy forward. So you got 40, 50 feet of fly line out if you can manage that much. I mean, you can move it quite a ways. It's pretty remarkable how quickly you can move a teeny tiny little fly 100 feet in total flight just with that energy transfer. Well, this flog would have a single grip, but then it would have 3 or 6 braids that were nowhere near as long as a whip. We're talking 1 to maybe 3 feet long on these individual little whiplets that came off of it. So you would have the energy transfer that would still occur as the executioner issuing this pain moved his hand forward. The individual whip portions of that flog are still moving faster as they snap onto the back of somebody you're striking than the guy's actual hand is moving. So it's mechanical advantage. There's still an acceleration that's occurring here. But whereas a whip will often have a little tuft at the end of it, and I think, again, Destin did a great job over on Smarter Every Day of explaining why that's there and what it does. That pop you hear with a whip, by the way, is the breaking of the sound barrier. That's how much the acceleration is happening. You can't break the sound barrier whipping your hand back and forth, but if you put a whip in your hand, moving your hand back and forth can generate the energy to break the sound barrier. That's crazy, and that hurts. With a flog, you could still get each of those individual braids, if they were a little bit longer, into that snap position, effectively breaking the sound barrier, though I think at a much slower speed than a whip. But the real key with the flog is what's in the end. The Romans would loop little chunks of rough lead into the end, 2 or 3 balls of rough lead per whiplet. Those of you who live in the South or in warm weather climates, this isn't going to make any sense to you at all. Those of you who live in the bold, brave, difficult North, you're going to register this one. You've seen snow tires, right? Studded snow tires. And they've got just those little pea-sized chunks of metal in them. And they're not perfectly formed. They're rough and they're rugged and scrapey. And the idea is they'll punch and dig down into ice and give you more grip using the weight of the car to dig into that ice and the forward momentum of the wheel. Well, effectively, they're tying 2, 3, sometimes even more of those into the end of each thong coming off the end of that flog, which means that not only are you getting a pretty good whipping because of the acceleration that occurs as those braids lag behind the hand of the whipper and then snap forward as the shoulder, elbow, and wrist snap forward. You get all that acceleration like swinging a baseball bat or a tennis racket. So you get that whipping motion that would hurt like crazy, but that whip motion also is digging those little chunks of metal. I've also heard that maybe bone or glass occasionally were woven or punched in there as well. It's forcing that into the skin. And then what's different at this point in the torture is where the person with the long bull whip would snap and pull back to prepare themselves to reload to do it again. The person wielding the flog would strike you and then yank. So as that metal digs into your back, it then runs an 8, 12, 16, 20-inch streak where each one of those pieces of metal hit. And if you pop somebody with that flog 20, 30, 40, 50 times, they're going to be absolutely cut to ribbons on their back. This would take you all the way down to muscle, even bone. It's something that certainly people could die from, certainly that you would never completely heal from. And if you ever took your shirt off again, you would bear the mark of a brigand. You would bear the mark of an insurrectionist, a murderer, someone who rebelled against Caesar, the God King, somebody who rebelled against the benevolent empire. You're wearing that badge for life, assuming you have a life after that. But you also take this punishment in public. It means everybody else gets to stand around and watch this kind of thing. I was listening to a great podcast the other day where the host was working through going to an execution or public punishment for sport and how that was part of an ancient mindset that now we'd feel, I think rightly, much more unease with. But there are people there. They want to know, What does it look like when you open up somebody's back? Ooh. How much blood is in a person and how much can they afford to lose? Ooh. Well, that's my political opponent. I don't like their opinions very much, and I'd like to see them taken down a peg, and I want them to know that I was here to watch it. Ooh. We've talked about the unbelievable pain and agony that would occur with this kind of torture, but it's worth noting on the way out the door that this was also something that was designed to brand you. This was also something that was designed to embarrass you, to humiliate you. I mean, think about how many of you would even loathe the idea of just having your shirt off in public. Not trying to be like gross or weird. Don't read into that. But that's a pretty scary, intimidating thing for many people. I mean, unless you're in your like 20s and you got the body completely toned for that little window of time where that's easy. I mean, come on. That's a little embarrassing. Now imagine being opened up and bleeding. That's kind of a vulnerable, awkward thing. Like, think about when you get a bloody nose in public and how quickly you rush off to take care of it. It just feels like the kind of thing that's a little too exposed. You don't need people to see that. Now imagine people seeing inside your body. Imagine being opened up so much that people can see parts of the inside of you that you've never even seen. Imagine the humiliation of being in that half-clothed state and having both people who respect you and people who despise you watch the muscular strength go out of you, watch the lifeblood go out of you, watch with each drag of that flog your capacity to sustain yourself diminished. It's meant to empty somebody of their humanity, of their dignity, of their strength, of their reputation. And in this case, it was meant to be an exclamation point before crucifixion. We're going to talk about what crucifixion looks like, and believe me, that would have got it done. It was plenty. The flogging was butter and is kind of strange. What do you do in Pilate? Why have him flogged and crucified if you're conflicted about it? Flogging sounds funny, and I suppose in the right context, you could form a pretty good joke around the concept. In this context, oh, it's dark. It ain't funny. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.